celebrity because he's drawing such large crowds. He spends most of the time in the Gospels avoiding these large crowds, but it tells us several times that he taught in all the synagogues. So it's not as if he was being rejected. Instead, he comes into the town, and as the visiting itinerant rabbi, he's given the opportunity to bring a Sabbath address to the congregation, or if it's not the Sabbath, he can just speak in the synagogue. Because synagogues are like ancient churches. We've been trying to make that point a couple of times, that we see the old Byzantine churches, and we see the benches along the walls and that sort of thing. But if you think of church as just some place that you go Sunday morning, that's not correct. That's not correct from an ancient church. An ancient church is more, well, if you grew up Catholic, how often do you have Mass, right? Every day. How many times is and not that you went every day, but the priest is there doing Mass every day. So too with the synagogue. You have 3 times of prayer every day. Three times that you would be attending prayer services if you were very devout and pious every day. And the sages say, early attendance at the synagogue. This is one of the things for which you receive a reward in this world and in the world to come. The synagogue is a center. It's a community center. It's more than just your house of worship. It's also a place where there's education that's happening here. The gathering for the court system operates out of the local synagogue. This is where the elders will hear court cases and that sort of thing. So it would be nice. It would be nice to bring you through a synagogue service, to step you through a whole synagogue service. We don't have time. Most of you went out to a synagogue service last Sabbath, right? So you saw how the Torah was brought out in the reading of the Torah and that sort of thing. We see a synagogue service in Nazareth. Our master goes into the synagogue. He goes up to read. It says he goes up to read. They hand him the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. He reads the prophecy from Isaiah. He says, "Today this prophecy is fulfilled in your hearing." He sits down. There's like a couple things. And it says he stood up to read. I remember this story where Shmuel Safrai, who was a teacher from with the Jerusalem Synoptic School, was writing with the Jerusalem Synoptic School. He made the statement that Jesus read the Torah in the synagogue in Nazareth. And his editor at the time, I believe, was David Biven. And David Biven said, no, it doesn't say that in Luke. It says he read from Isaiah. And Shmuel Safrai says, are you sure? And he flips open and he says, oh, right there, he stood up to read. And David Biven says, yeah, and it says, keep reading, it says they handed him the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. And Shmuel Safrai says, no, you don't understand. You stand up to read Torah. Yeah. Nobody stands up to read Isaiah. Instead, before you read the Haftarah, Isaiah, you would have to read the Maftir, or the end of the Torah portion. And then you receive the scroll of Isaiah, or the scroll of the Haftarah. So that's an idiom that's there in the text. Our master stood up to read. He received the last Torah reading. Then he's handed the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. Then it says he reads it and he sat down. Now, ordinarily, in our idiom, when the preacher stands up, everybody knows it's time for the sermon. He stands up, goes to the pulpit. In first century Jewish idiom, the teacher sits down, everybody knows it's time for the teaching. We'll go up to Mount of Beatitudes, where it says, when he saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain and he sat down, and his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and began to teach them. They see him sit down. Oh, the master's going to teach. He gets in the boat. He sits down. He begins to teach the parables. So he reads from Isaiah, and he sits down, and he begins to teach the kingdom. Today, these messianic promises of Isaiah are fulfilled before you. That's up in Nazareth, not here. But his sermon would have been very similar here and in every place he taught. Because every place he was going, he was teaching, proclaiming, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That was his message. Repent, because the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Now, some people suggest that when he sat down, he might have sat down in a chair like this. And the archaeologists have identified this chair as a chair, this ornate chair, as the chair that the teacher would sit in, or perhaps a dignitary would sit in. And there's an identification with a text in Matthew.
I've got it here, Matthew 23.
Okay,
Oh,
go
you
ahead.
got it open up?
Yeah, but I don't know what verse it's
23:1.
Okay, all right.
So 2.
All right, so it says, the master says, the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, etc., etc. All right, so the suggestion that the archaeologists who excavated here, when they found this ornate chair, is perhaps this should be identified with this chair of Moses, with the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in and are tying up heavy burdens. But I have a few problems with that suggestion, all of which I will tell you right now. First of all, how many scribes and Pharisees can you get in this chair? All right, I mean, that's not a serious objection, but there's a more serious objection is that we don't, a scribe doesn't sit down in this chair and issue a legal ruling, tie up a heavy burden on someone. The only people who really have the authority to issue such legal rulings are the people, the judges on the Sanhedrin. And in fact, that's who is in the crosshairs here in Matthew 23. It's not the local crowd, but rather our master is criticizing those who are in a position of legal authority. And the Sanhedrin that sits in Jerusalem, that can be described as the seat of Moses, because its institution in Exodus chapter 18 comes when Jethro says to Moses, it's not good for you to sit here all day and all the people to stand around. They're going to drive you crazy. Because Moses explains, well, I have to sit here and give them the law, interpret the law for them, and settle their lawsuits. And Jethro says, that's not a good plan. Instead of you sitting here, what you should do is appoint men to sit and hear these cases.